Okay, so thanks everybody for joining us today. The topic of this session is community-led growth, and I'm super excited because in the open source world, oh, someone maybe mute just a second. In the open source world, community-led growth is the norm, and we actually discussed this quite a bit yesterday at our open source panel. However, outside of open source, building community as a strategy for growth is still a relatively nascent concept. What should founders think about? When should founders think about community-led growth as a strategy? When should they not? What are the success metrics for community growth? So I'm super excited to be here with Nick Mehta and Ryan Hoover to discuss this. Nick is the CEO of Gainsight. By the way, congrats, Nick, on your recent partnership with Vista.
Thank you so much.
Nick has spent a ton of time creating the category for customer success software, especially early on, and used a lot of community-driven growth to achieve this. And Ryan Hoover is the founder and former CEO of Product Hunt, which is at the core is a community for both consumers and businesses, and a very beloved place for businesses to launch product. So I'm really excited to pick both of their brains today. Let's get started with maybe Ryan sharing a little bit of history, your journey of founding and building Product Hunt. And then I have some questions for you guys.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. I much prefer these virtual events. It's so much easier than traveling. So thanks for having me. But yeah, the quick kind of backstory on Product Hunt, it started initially 2013 was the inspiration. And I'm someone that always loved products, discovering new products, playing with products, even more as like an intellectual exercise. Like I'm the weirdo that would enjoy going through onboarding flows just because I was curious and like how people were approaching that particular product design, strategy. And from that, ultimately built Product Hunt, which is very much a community-driven company. So there's some companies that are, and we'll probably talk more about this, but some which are very obviously community-driven. Without community, they're nothing. And then there's others that, benefit from community, but necessarily aren't dependent on community. For us, pretty much everything is community. If you look at the website and the product itself, as proud as I am of it, that's not what makes it successful. It's not like we invented some sort of new technological breakthrough to make Product Hunt successful. And so a lot of our focus really from the very beginning was how do we build a strong community of people who love discovering new products like myself, who are early adopters, who are maybe makers, whether it's like some kid in Europe who's building a Chrome extension, or a new early stage company or startup who's trying to get their first users. A lot of our focus has been around building a product experience and a culture in a sense that people want to be a part of.
That's great. Hold that thought. We'll double click on a lot of things you said just a little bit later. And Nick, can you tell us a little bit about your journey to Gainsight? What attracted you to the idea, and how has Gainsight evolved from when you start leading it to today, and what's kind of next?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, our idea with Gainsight, actually part of it was, I think, anyone that worked on an early subscription cloud business had this basic realization, which is, oh my gosh, we sold these customers. Who's going to make sure that they're actually using the product and getting value, and so that they're going to stay with us, right? That's the whole concept of customer success. And obviously, if there's a new field like customer success, there's often an opportunity to build software to make that field more proactive and automated and scalable, right? Every time there's a new job, there's often software around that job. It wasn't rocket science idea. The challenge, though, was when we launched the company in 2013, there were like a few hundred CSMs in the world. So honestly, the total addressable market for our company was tiny. And so for us, as we'll talk more about, I'm sure, throughout this, creating the community of customer success people was existential to our business. And so we really had to not just create the category of customer success software, but help create the category of customer success as a concept.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's take a step back in terms of just how do you actually define community? And maybe let's hear from both of you. What does that mean for your respective businesses?
Yeah, happy to jump in. So on one side, a lot of people conflate community with audience. They look at their Twitter following and they're like, that's my community. And I think that's happening more and more as community is such a buzzword. Like everyone feels like they have to have a community strategy, which isn't actually true. It's not. I'm not the one that raise the community flag for every single situation. And so audience is not community. They're certainly related. For me, I kind of define community as one, there needs to be a feeling of belonging. Like the people in your community, they have to have some sort of sense of belonging ultimately to be, I think, to define it as a community. And furthermore, it also can't be one way. It can't be just the company or the people in the team communicating with users. It's really more about users interacting with each other. And that's where the real value is how do you build a community of people that feel a sense of belonging, who are providing some sort of value or exchanging in some way or another. And if you think about startup, all about like, how do you build scale? How do you do something at scale? And community and creating a place where people can come together and ultimately create, in some sense, like a community network effect can be really, really powerful.
That makes sense. Is there any way that you can measure the value as well as the belonging that you mentioned?
To be quite honest, I don't think there's like I can't prescribe like a traditional metric for every single company. I think there's a few ways of doing it. One is, I think there's a lot of metrics depending on your business. Some of them, for us at Product Hunt, for example, one of our core KPIs is actually community contributors. And what that means is these are the people that contribute in some way, whether it's a comment, an upvote, a post of some sort. And like with most platforms, including like Twitter and Reddit and many other social networks of sorts, they have a lot of people who are lurkers. And your goal kind of as a community is to hopefully convert more of those lurkers into contributors, and then hopefully more of those contributors into high contributors, people who are contributing a lot. So that's a very high level metric that we look at. But then I think there's also a fuzzy metric that maybe somebody smarter than me will figure out how to measure this accurately. But it's something along the lines of the belonging piece. Like, how do you measure people's affinity towards your product or your brand? And I think this represents or is illustrated in different ways. One of them is, do they wear your swag? For example, when we first started sending, Product Hunt kitty like stickers and T-shirts and things, we would get a ton of people on Twitter sharing photos of them wearing that swag. And I think that's a really good illustration. That's hard to measure, but it certainly illustrates a sense of like pride or belonging, or they're essentially putting their identity and their reputation at risk in a sense by associating themselves with your brand or your company. So I think there's a lot of like things like that to look for.
I do love the Product Hunt kitties. I have one myself, so thanks for sharing that. Nick, how about you? What's your definition?
I really like what Ryan said, because I think actually it's funny, if you go Google, I just did right now, community, you'll see like two definitions. Like the first one is basically like a bunch of people, right? That's like the audience definition. I agree with you, Ryan. That's not how I think of it. And the second one is a group of people that have a sense of fellowship. And I think that's a really good like belonging, fellowship. It's that feeling of connection that people have. And so in our little world, it's like all these people in this new job of customer success where, at least early on, other people didn't get what they did. Like they didn't understand it. And they're like, what do you even do? Is that customer support? And like your family doesn't understand it. And the people at your work with don't understand it. Your boss doesn't probably really fully get it. And yet you think they're onto something. And so you have this sense of fellowship that like you all, when you get together, you feel belonging. We have these big events where people come together, and it's just this incredible revival for people. We put up banners that say you're home, like you're together with your people. And you talked about metrics, John, just like for fun, like I do think it's these intangible things. Like in our world, we've created all these ridiculous things that we've done together. So like in the early days of our conference, like one time we're like, what if we try to sing along? Like if we just started singing and everyone sang together, and it actually worked. Like the whole audience was like singing along to like Sweet Caroline, right? And then like later on, it was like we made a music video where all the people were in it. And then like later after that, literally we made this like silly parody rap thing and rap single about customer success. If you can believe it, you can buy it on Spotify. There's probably been like 10 people that bought it. But like then we had people remake that song, like very much like your swag concept, Ryan. Like literally they took this ridiculous rap thing and then they did their own version of it. And then they had a competition around it. And it's this idea that these people jump into something and they feel like they're part of something that to the outsider world is ridiculous. But to them, it feels like they belong.
That makes a lot of sense. And I love how you guys have thought about this. One of the questions that I think is top of mind for lots of early stage founders is what you're describing requires resources and prioritization, right? You need dollars for marketing, for getting the swag and distributing that. How should companies think about prioritizing building community versus, let's say, other marketing efforts or sales efforts?
Yeah, I mean, on one side, it's kind of like anything else. You have to prioritize it among the many other things that you could be doing. So maybe revenue generation is actually a higher priority, and therefore you should be investing in, figuring out your business model and whatnot. I think this isn't a direct answer, but I think one way to approach is to think through a couple different questions. One of them is is your business dependent on community? So if it's product, then the answer is yes. Like that's what makes it special. If you're, let's say a B2B company, maybe not. Maybe you don't need community, but maybe you can benefit from it. And probably Nick will touch even more on his particular situation. Another one is there an organic community kind of forming around it? So let's say you have a product in the market, and is there already like some semblance of community happening like organically? In which case, there's a few reasons why you would want to invest in that. One, there's some semblance of like an opportunity there. There's probably an opportunity to improve that, to increase that, to make that stronger. But two, there's also damage control that you need to do potentially. Let's say there's a community forming, but then if you're not involved and you're not a part of it, and maybe it goes the wrong direction and becomes toxic in the severe case, that can actually be really detrimental to your company. And then the kind of third question that I come to mind is your target audience underserved? And this takes a lot of research and maybe intuition to probably fully understand this. But if you're building for, let's just take, rideshare drivers, for example. Let's pretend that Lyft and Uber weren't doing anything in community. There's a bunch of these rideshare drivers who are new to doing this. Many of them have never driven professionally. And there's no services at one moment in time. There was no services or community or belonging or like structure kind of around them. And I think that is a good example of like a very big and growing opportunity of people who could benefit from a sense of belonging and some sort of support in some way for this new job of theirs. And so I think that's just three different questions you could ask to try to get to that sense. I think it's hard sometimes to measure the ROI, compared to sales. Sales initiatives are the best because you can clearly tell, like, is it working or not? And the feedback loops are really, really short. Community, the feedback loops are medium to long typically. And the measurement kind of, as we touched before, can be difficult. Again, maybe there are people that will find better ways to measure this accurately, but I think it's very contextual on how you can effectively measure community's effect.
I love how you structured those three questions, and especially the underserved piece of it. Nick, in the early days when you thought about kind of investing in the sense of belonging versus some of the other functional efforts, how did you think about budget and allocating?
Yeah. I think for a lot of things in business, to me, I have to like always understand, where does this fit in the logic chain of what I'm trying to do? So to me, like, there's why you do things, there's what you're doing, and there's how you do it, right? And so like in some businesses, you might say, look, the why is I want to make money, and the what is I want to grow a revenue, and the how is a community. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way. And I think there's good ways to incorporate community into sort of that logic chain. Being totally honest, the why for us at Gainsight is we want to create a connection between human beings. And the what was, we think that there's an opportunity to create this connection through this new customer success movement. And the how was, we better eventually make money, otherwise the party will end at some point. It was like literally the opposite kind of chain of what most people might think. And so when you have that, like, I think actually a lot of the great communities out there, like the people that are leading those, it's part of their why. And so then, it's not as complicated because you're just like, we're going to do this and everything else we'll figure out how to do, but we're just going to do this. And this brings us joy. But I think that for other people, it's a how, it's a means to an end. And so I think there you have to get very specific, and, you can get measurable and all that. Now, even though it's our why, we have investors and other stuff we have to justify it. So there's a lot of stuff that we do that we look at people in the community and their likelihood to buy. And we also look at when people buy, how did that correlate to their community affiliation? And what we find is, out of the people that buy Gainsight software, like 100% of them tie a big chunk of that to the community in some way. You can draw a thread end to end. But to Ryan's point, the thread is long. The thread is a long thing, right? Like literally, I went to that event like 4 years ago, and then through that I met somebody and I got a new job. And then I actually sent my team to that event, and that changed the way our company works. And then we decided we need to get software. So it does require a bit more patience than as Ryan said, your classic sales and marketing investment.
Can you give us a sense of the different timeframes? So investing in sales is the next quarter, the following quarter. when you think about the time to value of a investment for community to kind of the results, what does that typically look like?
See, I think for us, it evolves over time. So you can do cohorts. We do this analysis of, okay, somebody came to this event and then, a year later, what happened, 2 years later, what happened, et cetera. And what we find is in the early days of our business, because it was so new, customer success was new, it couldn't be transactional. Somebody came to the event and 3 or 4 years later, something happened. Literally, there's like that lag, not because of anything wrong with community, but because they had to get everyone aligned around customer success and get their boss bought in. And that just took time. There's nothing you can do about it. It was a very efficient way to actually get people through the process. But now actually, as things are more mature, and actually the bigger your community gets, the more social proof there is. So literally somebody comes to Pulse, our conference, and they see 6,000 people around them, like, okay, I think there's probably something going on here. We better go do something. So actually, I think one good thing is the bigger your community gets, I think the shorter the cycle time to results, at least from my perspective.
That makes a lot of sense. Was there anybody, again, this is a question for both of you guys, that you hired to lead this effort from and also maybe just talk about organizational design in general? How do you incorporate a focus and initiative of community in your organizations?
I am actually really curious to hear Nick's answer, because he's approaching community in a very different kind of business. For us, it was always part of the very beginning. So on one side, I think no matter what, in my opinion, someone might have a different perspective, but the CEO should be involved in some capacity, at least in the beginning. And like anything that's important to the business, they should be involved. They shouldn't just outsource it entirely. And so on one side, I think the CEO should be involved in some capacity, but certainly it's hard to scale one person. So for us, we hired community really early on relative to other companies because, again, we're like a community-driven company. And so an example of that, like Eric Torenberg, for example, was super early on the team. And he's just a natural community builder. Like he thrives off of connecting people and supporting and helping, and he's just a machine. And so early on, he was instrumental in a lot of those things. But then we also, of course, built more of a team around it. Now we have a team that does a combination of actually community building and support. So we actually don't have a delineation necessarily between like customer support and community, because we feel those two things are very, very much tied together. And so for us, a lot of the team, we have, in terms of percentage of our team doing community in some form or another, it's very, very high. It's probably a third of the team is actively involved in the community on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's quite similar to us. We have, I was thinking about like the 4 roles that it took. And as Ryan said, it's like really part of everyone's job, and especially part of my job. But I think there's like 4 roles that like showed up over time. One was actually, who's the voice of the community that's like speaking and like getting people excited. Obviously I'm part of that, but also we had, our in our world, like customer success is our audience. So the customer success leader at Gainsight becomes a big voice of that too. So our first chief customer officer, our second one, and our third one, all 3 of them over time became voices in the community. So that was kind of one role. A second role.
For that when you were hiring them, their ability to, did you look for that when you were hiring them?
Especially our first one. The second and third, they were sort of growing up in the company, and the company had a brand. But the first one, we actually hired somebody who was running customer success at one of the early SaaS companies, Marketo. And so he had a bit of a credibility already and did an amazing job and unbelievable impact on the company. His name's Dan Steinman. Then sort of the second role is the creativity, because you want to find ways to engage people and you kind of make this feel special. And so Anthony Canada, our first CMO, just epic creativity about just coming up with all these crazy ideas, and it was great. And then the third role is kind of the execution, whether it's in person. There's a ton of stuff to do. Just like you all are doing this amazing event today. I mean, the amount of planning your team's done is incredible, right? And so that execution cannot be understated to do it well. And like, whether it's like in person and is the coffee like hot and like, can people get coffee, or it's online and is the video working, right? That stuff actually makes a huge difference. And then the fourth one I would say is the joker, which is definitely me, the person that's willing to like not take themselves too seriously and get people to feel like comfortable and be a little vulnerable and things like that. So those 4 roles, I think, in some way, and by the way, it could be one person, all those roles, or multiple, I think those were important for us.
That makes a lot of sense. I often see with our startups, and this is something that we recommend, you have a few metrics, right, for the whole company, North Stars, that the whole entire organization is working towards. Whether that's something as simple as ARR, or it's something around customer happiness. Did you guys have such metrics that kind of incorporated community as a success metric? Maybe
For us, yeah, it was community contributions I mentioned earlier is kind of a top level KPI. And then from there, you can, drill down into like sub metrics for that. We also, this was actually later in our history, and this blends into customer support actually, but we also started tracking sentiment for every customer support interaction. And since that is actually the primary interface for a lot of people, particularly new people who aren't necessarily part of the community already, the happiness rating of those interactions, I forget what our numbers are right now, but they're very high, and they've grown since we started working on that and making it a priority. So I feel like that also, customer support is like, that's the touch point with the company, which is in some ways like the gateway drug of sort to hopefully pull them into the community and be a part of it longer term.
For us, there were basically kind of 4 things that we looked at. So like at a North Star overall, we were trying to grow the customer success profession, right? That's what, so we looked at like literally how many people are in CS on LinkedIn and all that stuff. So that was, big picture. But then what we would look at for each different community thing that we did is basically, what was the attendance, how many people showed up, and then what was their experience. And so obviously we measure, send them surveys and, net promoter score and things like that of the event itself. And I would literally go through every survey response and read them all and kind of maniacal about that. And then what was the outcome for our business? Obviously, as I mentioned before, did those people go on to buy? But that last part took a while, right, for the cohorts to play out. And then what we looked at overall is just like literally, were we growing this community year after year? So in every slide deck probably ever from Gainsight, there's a chart of like Pulse is the name of our event. Every year, the growth of that community. And that's a huge thing that we looked at.
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. And culturally, what were some of the culture changes or implications to your organizations? Either as you're hiring or trying to grow the team through this. What are some of the cultural things that you change or were pretty mindful of to start with?
Yeah, for us, this was maybe a year and a half into Product Hunt. Corley was CEO, and she had a brilliant idea of let's articulate our culture. And the culture internally is actually the same as the culture externally that we're trying to build. And so the team, each individual came together with 5 different words they felt represented our culture and what we wanted to become. And we came out with 5 words. A few of them more specifically relevant to your question is one was kittenish, which means playful. We wanted Product Hunt to be a playful, enjoyable, kittenish place. Also curious, like part of the reason why Product Hunt even started was because I was just curious about new technology and products, and we want to build a place where people can come in with curiosity and optimism. And the third one I'll mention is authenticity was another one. And we want to create an authentic place. I think authenticity is often the core of a lot of communities. I think the ones that do it well, I think people thrive and thirst for authenticity. And especially in a world where it feels like there's less and less authenticity. And historically, we've seen like marketing and sales and things that kind of come off as very inauthentic. People are very averse to that. And so those were 3 of the words that we used, not only to hire and kind of use as filters for people that we wanted to work with, but also those are things that we wanted to represent in the community. And so we'd represent those through, just using the Product Hunt kitty as one example. It's ridiculous. It's a cat wearing Google Glass. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It makes people smile because it's so silly. And it's small things like that in the product experience that we try to infuse to bring that kittenish, playful kind of atmosphere. And then with the team itself, it's like, how do we communicate and what questions do we ask in the comments of Product Hunt? How do we engage with the community? In some ways, we, especially me in the early days, should be illustrating the behavior that we want to see. And people start to mimic. People, especially in early communities, they mimic what they're seeing. The same way that you mimic when you go to certain events, like a house party is very different than like a fancy gala. You're going to act probably differently. You're going to dress differently. And so setting the right culture and tone early on is super important.
Yeah. For us, community is both, the culture has to drive the community and the community drives the culture. So very similar to what Ryan said, we think these things are totally intertwined. And so for our employees, my gosh, our community is a huge part of why they work at Gainsight. They just love it. Like, they love meeting these people and building those relationships. And we're a very values-driven company like Ryan's company. And so we talk about our overall kind of philosophy as being human first business, bringing the real human to work every day. And then there's 5 values underneath that. And that human first concept shows up very much at every community thing that we do. We try to be extremely vulnerable. Authenticity is a very good word for that. Like we all try to practice what we preach, right? So like in front of, 6,000 people, I'm on stage talking about being lonely as a kid and depression and things like that. And so we try to all model that. And then because of that, all the customers bring that same vulnerability and openness. And so I feel like our culture and the culture of the community are almost like one and the same. And one example, one of our values is childlike joy, very similar to Kidnish. And it's about bring the kid in you to work every day. And what that means is it causes everyone in the community to bring that childlike joy. And that means the karaoke mic is fierce at these events, and people they are willing to be themselves. And so I feel like that's one lesson is for me is you need a culture for your community, and ideally if it can be the culture that your company has and it's just like one and the same, I think that's a superpower.
That's great. That's great. Let's go back a little bit to one of the things that Nick, you described, which is budgeting, which I think is a question for very early stage founders. When you're a B2B company looking at your seed and Series A and Series B, at what point, and maybe you can describe this from your experience at Gainsight, at what point do you deploy more capital resources to community building, versus less? Like at what point can you credibly make the case for your investors that this is going to pay off?
Yeah, it's interesting because I do think that early on, it's actually more energy and time and passion than it is just dollars. And then eventually you start being a real company and people expect a little more polish. Like actually in the early days, what's cool is honestly, like you can literally, if back when, in pre-COVID, you could just do this with a event with like pizza and Safeway, wine or something like that, right? You can actually get away with that. And then as you get bigger, like it'd be a little weird if you raise all this money to not do something a little nicer, right? And so I actually think it's not a budget issue in the early years. It's time and also being willing to be vulnerable and authentic in yourself and your values. But then eventually it becomes a budget thing. And I think one of the things that's cool about a lot of B2B communities is they can become there'll still be money you'll spend, but there's some level of self-funding, right? Because if it's valuable, you can charge for it in various ways. You can obviously charge people to come to your events. You can create subscriptions to the community. You can actually have sponsors for the community. And so one of the things we did from the very beginning is all of our events, you had to pay to go. And I think that was just lucky that we made that decision. But I think if you do that, if you force people to pay, then you force yourself to deliver value. Because they paid all this money, we better do something good. And so, for example, our events are not about Gainsight. They're about the customer success field. And we don't make it a commercial about us because that's not worth paying money for. And so I think that's some element of like, you need to build a financial plan into this and almost turn it into a little business, not to make money, but to make it more sustainable.
That makes sense. And you mentioned that your events, even from the get-go, were paid by your customers. How was the first one, and what did you guys, any advice for entrepreneurs who are looking to launch their first and paid event?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the thing, it's funny, we didn't have any customers at the first event. We had like 5. So we were like, if we did an only customer event, it'd be super depressing because there'd be nobody there. Like maybe my mom would show up. I don't know who else would be there. And so we basically decided to make it a community event. And so we said, okay, well, there's all these people interested in customer success. Let's just get them together and they can learn from each other. And let's not have any sessions about Gainsight. And let's do like a CEO panel on what you think of customer success. And let's have VPs of CS talk about how they compensate their team and have people talk about career paths and whatever, right? Maybe get one outside speaker. And so that's kind of what we did. And by the way, I think a lot of people do this. This is like a super common playbook now. And I think it really works. I think the key thing is identifying an audience that is not well served. I mean, we haven't talked about this yet, but to me, like you want a community of people that have some fellowship. Part of that is they don't feel fellowship elsewhere. So for us, we were lucky that CSM didn't have that. And so therefore we had this thing. I think it's harder to go do it for a profession where there's 300 different places that they can go hang out. One kind of funny way I think about it is find a group of people where nobody's already taken them out to dinner. And B2B world, right? Like, and if lots of people are taking them out to dinner, I don't know if that's really going to be a community. So sometimes it means going more junior in the organization. It doesn't have to be the senior executives, right? It could be like the manager of an individual function who's maybe doesn't really have that identity and fellowship and all that, but love to get that. So that's my thought.
I like that. And we oftentimes brainstorm that at our firms too. The founders get invited to every single dinner, but who's not?
That's exactly right.
In the early days, maybe you can describe your first cohort of enthusiasts for Product Hunt. What were the individuals like, and why were they not belonging anywhere else?
Yeah, it's I mean, the very, very first people were friends, to be truthful. So, 10, 20 people. And the email address, so the email list is how Product Hunt started. So it wasn't actually a website and community in the beginning. It was really just an email list. But that email list was actually, from the very beginning, community driven, that it was actually a number of contributors. And so these were actually people who were investors, early stage founders, people who are very interested in just new technology, just like myself. So they're like the kernels. And then from there, what we quickly realize is, like, with a lot of communities, you see, like, almost like you can classify them as different waves of people. So you have one, it's like friends. So very small, very intimate. But then it quickly grows into those friends of friends. And then from there, it goes global. And for us, what we kind of realized over time, and what Product Hunt is today, is it's very much a global community. About 45% of people are in the US. The rest are everywhere else. With like India actually being a really large population for us, relatively speaking. And a lot of these, I guess the how I classify these people, a lot of them are in tech hubs, or maybe outside of like your typical like San Francisco or like New York kind of ecosystems. And they're thirsting to be a part of a tech community, and they're thirsting to connect with other people in technology. And maybe they don't have that in their own city. I think I used to be in San Francisco until recently. San Francisco, of course, is like, it's all tech. it's like hard not to run into other tech people. And there's a million events, and there's a million, different pockets of tech related communities that you could be joining. But a lot of other cities don't have that. And so we found, like, sometimes the most engaged, most active people are the people who we didn't start with, but they're the people that kind of eventually spread into. And those are the ones that in some ways have the greatest thirst for belonging, or the greatest thirst for a community like Product Hunt.
That's great. And do you see, given that the cohort that you're describing is underserved, right? Maybe in the early days, it was the very well-served crowd, investors and founders in the Bay Area, and then expanded into the underserved community. Are they becoming more and more well-served? And maybe this is like an evolution of community. Does the community get threatened over time? And same with customer success.
Threatened by like other options or
other places,
other
where
communities.
They can belong.
Yeah. I mean, on one side, there's always going to be people like any product that churn. And, there are people who are literally posting multiple products every day on Product Hunt in the early days for like 2 years straight. Now they don't visit Product Hunt anymore. And that's inevitable in some capacity. Like, I think there's always going to be some churn in community. And there'll also be new people who come up. So, we've been around 7 years roughly. And there's people who, like kids, who are just exploring computer science for the first time and building their first products. And they're now entering Product Hunt for the very first time. It's day one for them, even though we're 7 years old. And so I think there is an evolution of how a community kind of grows or changes over time. I'd be very curious to see how, like, the next 7 years, what it looks like, to be quite honest. But I think it's just part of, like, when you're building a community, I think it just needs to be top of mind in terms of how do you make sure it's fresh, interesting? How do you avoid any potential toxicity or issues that might arise? Because that also can happen, where you see a community, it's really great in the beginning, and then it starts to go south and then gets worse and worse and worse. And so that's something that we think a lot about as we're going into, year 8 coming up here.
Yeah.
And similarly, I think, Nick, customer success now is a well understood community, thanks to you and some of the work that you guys have done. What's your sense of competition, and any places that you're going to be investing further to expand or differentiate the community? Yeah,
this is a super hot topic, and it's very parallel to what Ryan talked about. One thing I think it's important to think about is, like, each individual is on their own journey, right? So some people are using Product Hunt for the first time ever. Some people are coming to customer success for the first time ever. Some people have been doing it 7.5 years. They were at the first Pulse conference 7 years ago, right? And so there is this sort of like reality that you've got this group of people who aren't all in the same part of the journey. And so we are actually literally actively talking about this exact thing of what's the future of our community. We'll still have all these new people coming in, and there's still lots of stuff we can do. But then you've got these people that have been there for a long time. And by the way, there's multiple like other organic communities for customer success in different cities and different areas. And so there's a lot of different ways you can get knowledge because, as you said, Joanne, there's like a lot of CS people out there. So it's not like Gainsight's the only way to find them now, right? And so then we have to think about what are the ways we want to be uniquely value added in this new world. So there's going to be new people. We're probably still pretty good at that. There's senior executives. We're really good at that. You know, there's probably functions that inside customer success don't get as much attention. There's a function called customer success operations, which is the people that do like analytics and stuff. And so that's like one good one that we're spending some time on, and, you know, a sub community around that. And then the only other thing I'd add in is I think there's another human element to this, which probably is true in product hunt, which is there is like, in general, like we like to be special and different. And so therefore, when things get big, they don't feel special and different anymore. And it's not like this cool thing that I just found and, oh my God, you got to check this thing out. It's like, well, everyone knows that. Right. And so it is an interesting challenge of how do you keep the intimacy and the authenticity as things grow. I mean, that's just like a general human challenge we all have. But I think it's an interesting one that we all wrestle with the community.
Are there communities that you guys admire that are large and still feel very intimate? I mean, outside, whether it's in or outside of tech?
There's two I'll touch on actually. So one, Reddit, I think, so actually community and product they need to be talking. The community, the product reflects the community and vice versa. And I think whoever's leading the community side of things should be very in touch with like the head of product or whoever's kind of filling that role. And I think if you look at Reddit, the model of Reddit, the product kind of model enables for scale because there are subreddits for every single niche. And while Reddit is massive, you might find this tiny little subreddit with 100 people subscribed of people who are your homies, like the people that you identify with, or they're talking about a particular topic that you just love. So I do admire a lot of what Reddit has done, and it's proven to scale for many, many years to every kind of niche that you could imagine. And then another example, more recent one, is Clubhouse. And more specifically, I think they've done a really good job on onboarding. And for those that don't know, in the beginning of Clubhouse, in the very, very beginning, it was like one room. You open it up and you're talking to whoever's on Clubhouse, single room, nothing else. And of course, now there are rooms that you can create, that other people can create. But what they do for new users is really brilliant. When you join, other people that know you that will get notified. And it'll say like, Bob, your friend Bob just joined. And it'll give you an opportunity, someone who's already a part of the Clubhouse community that already knows how Clubhouse works, will get an opportunity to create a room with Bob to welcome Bob. And so every day you'll see a bunch of these welcome rooms, and they'll have, you know, a few people in them sometimes just saying, hey, welcome Bob. And Bob will be like, how does this work? This is new to me. I don't know how this thing works. And the community themselves is actually introducing the product to Bob and kind of educating him on like how it works and how they use it, what value they get out of it. And so that is a system that can be repeated for every single person, you know, to infinity. And I think it's just a brilliant way to be onboarded into a product. And it's very similar to the way that Paul onboarded me. When he sent me this test flight link, I jumped into a room. I didn't even know what he was building. And all of a sudden he was welcoming me, and we were chatting about Clubhouse and what he was building. And that like intimate experience is definitely creates, is more memorable and more exciting to be a part of.
For sure. We're small investors in the very, very early stage, and it's been really fun to see how Clubhouse has evolved and use some of a lot of community building concepts we were talking about here in building the products. There's a couple of questions from the audience. I want to make sure we address them. Any tips from you guys on identifying the underserved and underloved communities that may be opportunities for founders? Maybe Nick, you can start.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that I mentioned this idea that like they feel like they don't fit in. I mean, that's probably the real, like you talked about belonging, Ryan, up front, right? It's people that feel like they're different and don't fit in, but ideally that's growing, right? That's that is the magic. It's like a small growing thing that doesn't feel like it fits into the normal fabric. And so I think you'd have to really like be close to kind of companies on the cutting edge to find those pockets of people, right? So it's pretty straightforward that you go look at newer companies, you look at a Clubhouse, or you look at a Superhuman or whatever, and like the roles that are in there, and are there any roles that are different and they're underserved or whatever. That's sort of one part of it. And I think the other part of it is that I think that you have to believe that across all these folks, they feel not just like a common business need, but then some kind of like human kinship, like customer success. One of the reasons it works is there's sort of a personality type of people that go into that, right? And obviously empathetic and whatever. And so I think you ideally have something where there's a personality type that's a thread across all these organizations.
I'll give a.
Is there a community, maybe just to follow up on that, Nick, that you would go and tap into if, let's say, you're not leading Gainsight and you're doing something new? Is there a group of people that you think you may be drawn to in terms of creating that community?
I haven't thought about anything but Gainsight for 7.5 years. So I don't have a good answer to that. So I don't. But I think I'll pick an example of like a company I invested in that Bar Moses was one of our amazing employees at Gainsight, and she started a company called Monte Carlo that's about basically data quality. And it sounds super nerdy, right? Data quality, but like data quality is actually super important in making business decisions. And there's a lot of companies where that's a real challenge, and there's people that work on it. And so I don't know if that's going to be a big community or not, but I know that that's like a different population that it's like important, but it's new and it's different. Like that's the kind of thing I would look for.
That's great. That's great. And Ryan, how about yourself?
Yeah, on the second part, so my friend Greg Eisenberg, he's built social products over the years and is one of the most natural community builders I know. He actually has some tactical advice on this, and I'm going to use Reddit again as another example. He's actively looking at subreddits, and there's tools like Reddit lists that you can use to understand which Reddit subreddits are emerging, what are growing. And I think Reddit or any big giant network of some sort, Twitter included, is really interesting to look at, because if you can find these subreddits that are starting to grow, that might be an opportunity or at least a signal of like a greater sense of desire to collaborate or come together. And while Reddit might be a great place for those people, you can always build a better verticalized experience for that particular vertical. So if it was like, let's say 7-8 years ago, like before GOAT and StockX and all of those things, like there were subreddits on sneakers and sneaker culture. And if you could have seen that kind of growth early on and built a community around sneakerheads on the internet and built a verticalized like brand and community for that could be very powerful. So I think there's a lot of really cool insights that you can use just by browsing Reddit and kind of digging into those communities.
As a follow-up, any tools to build community? I know this is you mentioned Reddit and Twitter as places to go and identify underserved communities. Any tools once you identify those, any tools to grow communities that you would recommend?
Yeah, there's, so on the Twitter side, I use TweetDeck. I've used it for years. It's always a command tab away, for better or worse. And TweetDeck, for those that don't know, I don't know how people use Twitter without it. It's great because it provides multiple columns, and you can create a column for anything. So it could be a unique search query. For me, I have a search query for any mention of Product Hunt, which includes misspellings. It also includes any links to Product Hunt. So for years, I'm kind of able to see like, what are people saying? What are they linking to? What's the conversation? Certainly I see like issues that come up, whether it's like a bug or support issues. And so in many ways, TweetDeck is like the pulse. It's like the external pulse of your community. Another tool that we use at Product Hunt is called Bevy. Specifically, well, before COVID, we were using it to organize a bunch of in-person events. And the beauty of Bevy is that they make it operationally much easier to scale community-driven events. To date, we've had 500, maybe 600 community-led events around the world in corners of the world that I didn't know existed. And Bevy just makes it a lot easier to track those things and also report like attendees and things like that, which is otherwise very difficult to manage. And then one kind of last tool, it's not the most creative one, but Intercom is really useful. Of course, for like support, but it can also be useful for outbound targeted messaging, like on the site or in your app, if you want to target subsets of your community or particular audiences.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Just one last thing before we go. Any last tips for aspiring entrepreneurs who are looking to build like you guys have? Any last tips and tricks?
I guess one final closing statement. I think with a community, you're building an asset, and it doesn't pay off right away, for sure, as we talked about early on. But what's cool about an asset that's different from a transaction, you work on a sales deal, you close the deal, you got the revenue, and that's it. You build a community, you built an asset that literally will help you for like the next decade, assuming you keep managing it and grooming it and all that stuff. And so I do think communities have it's like a long payback period, but it is a massive payback long term.
Yeah,
Makes a
that's
ton of
it's a really good point. I think we've talked a lot about like how do you find communities, how do you what maybe tools you use, but also at the end of the day, it has to be authentic. So for example, I'm probably not the one to build like a makeup beauty community, to be honest. Like maybe if I partner with someone who is like really authentic and understood that space and could speak the language, maybe that would work, but I'm not the one to be the face of it. Kind of going back to what Nick said around like how do you have someone be the face? Like when people think about the community, they need to oftentimes associate with somebody, at least in the early days, like associate with a human. And so I think that's really important, is just to think like be realistic and authentic to yourself or your company.
I love the suggestions. Thank you both again for sharing all the insights. This was super interesting to me, and I'm sure to our audience. A reminder to everybody, I think we're taking an hour break until 1 o'clock, where we have at that point another session on the main stage. And for some of you guys, there'll be partner office hours starting at 12. So if you're signed up for that, please come and join us. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Take care.